Hello, Year 12. It's me again, Miss Theka, for your next lesson. We are moving on slightly now. So, obviously, the first chunk of learning for the Stuarts is James. Then the second chunk is Charles. We have just finished chopping off Charles's head, so now we are moving on to, I like to think of it as kind of the final third of the entire course, really, where we look at life after the execution of Charles, the aftermath of the civil wars, plural, we've still got one more that we need to look at, and how the government, the army, Cromwell, and other key figures that we haven't talked about yet try to mop up the mess that has been made by the civil wars and by the execution of the monarch, Charles. So today we are thinking about the establishment of the Commonwealth, the role that Cromwell played in that. And you'll notice with this sort of final third of the course, to be totally honest, quite a few students say that this is the trickiest part of the course in comparison to James and Charles. James and Charles play out quite chronologically, everything tends to happen in quite nice chunks, whereas you might maybe find with this final third, sometimes we're hopping backwards and forwards in time a little bit, because we have to look at religious factors, financial factors, social factors. We also have to consider the role of new individuals that we never talked about before, and how their importance grows and develops over time. But hopefully you'll be able to follow me and you won't find it too tricky. No 20-mark questions with this one. Again, remember we are on completely 30-mark questions now, so they still carry it all the way through to the end of the course. So, sorry, I hope you can't hear my boyfriend on the phone in the background. He is completely unaware of just how loud he talks when he's on the phone. So I sent you an email a bit ago, and this was one of the instructions that I gave you. You need to now be starting to use your Commonwealth knowledge organiser. As far as I'm aware, this is the first page of your Commonwealth knowledge organiser. So early Stuarts, the parliaments of the Commonwealth. If you don't have it, although I'm fairly confident I did give you all a copy, if you're watching this now and you're thinking, what on earth is she on about, please email me and I will send you either the entire thing or I'll just send you the relevant pages that you need, because I think it's quite a chunky document to send via email. First thing I want you to do is pause me, find this page. I made this for the knowledge organiser as just a little bit of a run through in terms of Oliver Cromwell. The name should sound familiar now because we've been talking about him for a wee while, especially when we're starting to look at the formation of the New Model Army and Civil Wars 1 and 2 and the execution of Charles. But he becomes a much more poignant figure in the next several years after the execution of Charles. And we are going to be talking about Cromwell till the sheer point where you are absolutely bored, sick of him. But nonetheless, what I find is when I first start to teach about Cromwell is there are quite a few common misconceptions about him. Cromwell is undoubtedly one of the most enigmatic figures of British history. He is a name that a lot of people know and they think they know him, but they maybe have just heard myths or have common misconceptions about him. So whilst he is a dominant figure in our history, he's also a very controversial figure. So what I want you to do is give this first page of your knowledge organiser a read from me, please. If you've got a hard copy, feel free to crack on and highlight it. If you don't have a hard copy, you need me to send you one, then maybe just give it a read and make some notes about his early life, his military career, which obviously we've talked about a little bit already with the New Model Army and the Civil Wars, but then also give these boxes a read here about common misconceptions about him. I've got quite a few of these from, I follow a really cute page on Twitter, which I do actually need to send you all a link to that, I've forgotten to do that. A really cute page on Twitter, which is the Oliver Cromwell Museum, which is set up in his old primary school, I think, down south, and they put some really good stuff online about him, so I've got quite a few bits from them. So give these boxes a read, give it a highlight, make some notes, and then come back to me and we will carry on. Okay. So hopefully you've given the Oliver Cromwell stuff a read. So now I'm just going to give you quite a basic introduction as to what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. Hopefully in person, touch wood, but if not, I'll keep doing it this way. So this is a badly taken photograph by me of quite a large page in one of the textbooks that I use. You don't have this textbook, it's a teacher version, and it's basically a timeline. If you see right at the top here, it starts in 1649 with the execution of Charles I in January, and then all the way down here it stops in 1660, and that is the end of our course, and that period is known as the Restoration, where they bring back the monarchy and they ask Charles's son, Charles II, to come back and be king. So we have got to look at all of this in between. Now, as I said earlier, some students often find this part of the course a little bit tricky because if you see on this side here, there's an awful lot of lines, dashes, dots, subcategories, different sections. It's certainly not as straightforward as back in the golden days where we looked at Cheeky James and Naughty Charles. So first of all, we have this period here, which is going to certainly take us a couple of lessons to get through. This period is known as the Commonwealth. So this starts after the execution of Charles in January 1649, and it breaks here in December 1653 with the end of a parliament known as the Nominated Assembly. We haven't done that yet, so you don't know anything about the Nominated Assembly. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But you can also see here, within this time frame, that there are two more lines here. One long line for the Rump, which cuts off here, April 1653, and then another wee little line here for the Nominated Assembly. So that should tell you that there were actually two different parliaments within the Commonwealth. First of all, the Rump that we've been talking about for a little bit now. The Rump, effectively created by the army after Pride's purge in December 1648 by Colonel Pride, organised by Henry Ireton, where they would only let radical members of Parliament, radical MPs, enter Parliament again because the army were concerned that their push for the trial of Charles wouldn't go ahead if they'd allowed moderate MPs to sit. So the Rump lasts for several years after the execution of Charles, but then it's forcibly dissolved by Cromwell. Again, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I'm just giving you a wee bit of an introduction. And we see the introduction of the Nominated Assembly. The Nominated Assembly go by several different names. They're sometimes known as the Parliament of the Saints as well. Or bare bones as well. They have lots of different names, but they only run for a short period of time, from April 1653 to December 1653, before they dissolve themselves. And that's why we have ... all these dashes here, because we have a new break from this time period here. So this time period is known as the instrument of government. This is a new constitution that was formed by leading members of the army, where they decide to try to start again and make a better go of running the country than the Rump and the nominated assembly had done. But then, sorry, I hope you're staying with me, we've also got these dashes here. First Protectorate, Second Protectorate, and Richard Cromwell's Protectorate. So this time period here is no longer called the Commonwealth. This time period is known as the Protectorate. And it's called that because after the nominated assembly dissolve themselves, they ask Oliver Cromwell to become Lord Protector of the country, because they feel as though he would be the best person for the job, effectively. He accepts that role, and we see the 2 protectorate parliaments that he holds during this time period. The first one is through a constitution known as the instrument of government. That fails. And we see a second one drawn up known as the humble petition and advice. However, Cromwell dies. He's got to die at some point. And his son then takes over, which I'm hoping this might sound a little bit dodgy to you, because if your son inherits your position, well, doesn't that just sound like a monarchy, like a king? Yes, it does. Again, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but we get to a stage now where effectively, particularly after the humble petition and advice, Cromwell is almost acting as king, even though he killed a king. It passes on to his son Richard, who does a fairly terrible job, and that is where we start to see the path towards the Restoration, where Charles II is formally invited back to become king. So an awful lot happens within actually quite a short time frame. If we think about James, and we kind of look at him in different chunks, like finance, religion, foreign policy, attitude towards Parliament, that kind of thing. That's over a much longer time frame, but it's certainly easier to teach and it's easier to digest, because it's not as split as this here, and the same could go for Charles, really. So as I said, when I make my way through this, it might not be entirely chronological. We might have to jump back at certain time periods and see how different issues are evolving and developing. But hopefully I'll try to do it in a way that is as simple as possible, so you can follow me, even though I'm teaching you in spirit via the power of YouTube and not in person. Okay, so top part. This is a section that we're going to be focusing on for the next couple of lessons, and this is known as the Commonwealth from 1649 to 1653. So it's important to note that this period is known as the Commonwealth. This starts after the execution of Charles, January 1649, until the end of the nominated assembly in December 1653. However, this time period is also sometimes called the interregnum. If you've ever heard of that before, you can kind of see where I've badly chopped off the top of this timeline here, finding your way around the English Republic. An interregnum. The interregnum is the entire period as a whole, starting from the execution of Charles I until the restoration of his son in 1660. The interregnum is a period where normal government is suspended and things are not running the way that they should. So if we hop back here, all of this, Commonwealth, Protectorate and Restoration, all of that is the interregnum period. Whereas this little chunk here, from 1649 to 1653, that's just known as the Commonwealth. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so again, I've taken a picture of this with my phone, so sorry if it's a bit blur. What I want you to do is have a skim read through this timeline, starting from the trial and execution of Charles until Cromwell expels or dissolves the Rump. have a read through. Is there anything you notice about quite a lot of these events? If you had to sum up this short time period, how would you sum it up? Hope that makes sense. So pause me for 2 minutes, have a read of all of the key events. Have you noticed anything? How would you sum up this time period? Right, so you can see I've put little red boxes around some of these events here. That is because I'm hoping that as you made your way through this timeline, you might maybe have noticed there is an awful lot of upheaval during these short few years. Leveller leaders arrested, expedition to Ireland, Cromwell suppresses Leveller mutinies, Cromwell's Irish campaign begins, massacre at Drogheda, massacre at Wexford, Cromwell appoints the leader army to fight against Scotland. It's a lot of war, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of mutinies, upheavals, expeditions. This is a time of extreme unrest, which might seem a little bit odd because people think, at this point, well, the civil wars are over and Charles is dead. So what on earth are people fighting about? Well, it isn't just as simple in the fact of, well, we've chopped Charles's head off, so surely all of our problems have gone away. Well, actually, no. Chopping Charles's head off created a problem within itself because they did the most extreme thing by executing the king, and then they didn't really have a plan as to what was going to come after that execution, which I know seems bizarre, but it all unravelled quite quickly. If you think about Pride's Purge, which happened in December 1648, within the first few days of January 1649, the trial was already taking place, and then Charles was executed a few days later. So it was rushed, it was done very quickly, very abruptly, and then once Charles was dead, well, he's dead. Then what? What are you supposed to do? They hadn't really thought about the next steps after the execution of Charles. I think a lot of these MPs thought once Charles was executed, some of these issues would resolve themselves, but actually it didn't. The execution of Charles caused a lot more problems. So we see as soon as the Commonwealth is formed, they face essential and key problems. The Commonwealth, I'd like you to make notes from this please, I've put some of the key bits in red. The Commonwealth was a period in which the new English Republic struggled to protect itself from enemies at home and abroad. Cromwell was used immediately to eliminate the threat from within. That was considered as being the most key thing. So we've gone now from 30 years war across Europe, the Spanish threat, to now actually the biggest threat being our own people. Cromwell was issued to crush both the Irish and the Scots. We'll do that in a completely separate lesson, but this is known as the Third Civil War. So obviously the First Civil War, we're talking John Pym, Charles I, sorry, I forgot his name then. John Pym, Charles I, Cavaliers versus Roundheads. Second Civil War, Pym is dead. This is where we see more of the use of Cromwell. Charles signs the engagement with the Scots and starts the Second Civil War. Then Charles is executed, and then we have the Third Civil War against Ireland and Scotland. In England, the government strove to reassure the nation that the revolutionary events did not threaten English society. However, it was Cromwell who eventually has to actively overthrow the Rump Parliament. So, and you'll notice that I use this term constantly. It's something that previous A-level groups very much enjoyed taking the mick out of me for. We often see Cromwell stuck between a rock and a hard place. Cromwell, at times, did not want to mix the power of the army and the power of Parliament. He wanted them to be separate. And at some time periods when he's active within the army, he refuses to take his seat as an MP because he argues that they shouldn't be linked. But actually, the situation on several occasions becomes so tense and progress isn't being made that Cromwell, the army man, has to directly intervene with politics, and it is him that eventually forcibly dissolves the Rump using soldiers from the New Model Army, which that should ring a bell because what Cromwell does with the Rump is pretty much the same as what Charles did. If you remember Charles storming the Houses of Parliament, trying to arrest the 5 MPs, using his armed guard to forcibly dissolve them. That was seen as being a really shocking event and an extreme challenge on parliamentary privilege and parliamentary liberties. Yet, several years later, Cromwell is actually doing that himself now, and he is forcibly dissolving a parliament using the military as his aid. So you can see how Cromwell is kind of pushed and pulled from both sides. In his heart, he's a military man, but then often he does have to get involved with politics. So some of the key problems facing the Commonwealth, actually the biggest problem is from within, not outside. The Republic had become split. On one side, you have got these radicals. They're expecting big changes. They don't just see the civil wars and the execution of Charles. They don't just see that as being a war that they've won. They see it as being a social revolution. They want more reform. They want religious reform. They want political reform. Some want to see the franchise. The franchise is what they termed as being the right to vote. They want the franchise extended, so they want equal rights. Not equal rights as we think about it today, but they were certainly heading more in that direction. So we see a growth, a kind of a splurge in radical thinking, and they think, you know, hell, if now's not the time to bring about this change, when is the time? We've just killed the king, for God's sake. Now, surely it is perfect to bring about these amazing social changes. However, on the other side of the spectrum, you've got a growing number of MPs that are actually reluctant to promote too much reform, and they're starting to get a wee bit nervous about all of this change. They want to stick with a more conservative approach, which some people, when I teach this in lessons, they look at me like, well, that's ridiculous. How can you be a conservative when you've just killed the king? Well, let me put it to you this way. Sorry, my email's bleeping. Some of the MPs that agreed with the trial and execution of Charles argued that they had done the most radical thing by executing the king. They couldn't possibly have committed a more radical act. They've done something so radical in order to preserve conservatism. Does that make sense? Some MPs argued that the only way to restore the natural order and the only way to restore common law and to bring back the status quo, to make everything right again, was to do something really radical by killing the king. And some of them thought that once Charles was executed, then things would settle and they would be able to go back to the way that things were, even though they didn't have a king anymore, which was a little bit naive by some people. Cromwell, God bless him, is often stuck on both sides here and often tries to please both sides, with often resulting in rather poor outcomes for him. Whilst he was desperately trying to rally support for the new regime, which he has helped to create, he hasn't single-handedly created this Commonwealth, but he's certainly played a part in it, is desperately trying to convince old friends to support the new Commonwealth. So we know that some leading members of the New Model Army and some of Cromwell's oldest military friends, like Lord Fairfax, completely deserted him during the trial and the execution of Charles because they fundamentally did not agree with it and really stepped back. Cromwell is rallying towards those old friends now. The deed is done, Charles is dead, everyone now needs to get on board with the new regime. But he can't rely too much on those old friends because actually he's now got a new group of radical reformers that want his support too. The vast majority of soldiers that served within the New Model Army are radical reformers, and you could call some extremists, and they're looking at Cromwell as their leader now that Lord Fairfax is taking a back seat, and they want him to support them. And to some extent, Cromwell does. This, again, will be something we do a little bit later down the line, but Cromwell is very keen on something known as liberty of conscience, which is basically the idea that we all have a right to worship God in our own way. We all have a right to believe what we believe. Even though he was a Puritan within himself, he is accepting of some other religious sects, and he does show some religious toleration, although I use that word toleration with a little bit of because it's certainly not our definition of toleration, but back then it was considered tolerant. So when I say that Cromwell was a religiously tolerant man, I don't mean to everybody. So if you're a Catholic, you've got no chance. Cromwell is not religiously tolerant towards Catholics. He hates them with a burning passion. But he does show some tolerance towards Jews, which was quite controversial at the time. Jews have always been persecuted throughout history, and Cromwell does actually welcome them back into England after a brief period where Jews were expelled from the lands. So you can see that the Commonwealth has certainly got off to a really rocky start. They've got many problems from within with no real solutions as to how to solve it, really. So again, I've taken this picture on my phone, so apologies if it's not very good. Oh, actually, I think I've made it a little bit bigger there. Yeah, I'll come back to that one. Yeah, hopefully you can read that. So as I've said, the main issue faced by the Commonwealth was from within, not outside, and that's because the Commonwealth was split. So just pause me a little bit now. If you can't make this out, it's a rather poorly drawn cartoon of Cromwell walking across a tightrope over a waterfall. But you can see quite nicely the balancing act that he's trying to do. He's got revolutionaries on one side that are demanding further change, and he's also got those that are very concerned about this change, and they're actually wanting to restore some of the more traditional values and get things back to normal now that Charles is being executed. So pause me for a minute. Just give both of those boxes a quick read and make a couple of notes from them, please, about the balancing act that Cromwell is playing after the execution of Charles. Right, so, as I've said before, this leaves the Commonwealth in quite a fragile position, because even though the army is supposed to be taking a step back, that actually isn't the case, and this leaves Cromwell in a rather contradictory manner, often trying to please both sides, which it couldn't be done because the situation becomes so tense between Parliament, the army, radicals and moderates. that you would think that they hadn't actually fought on the same side during the civil wars. These people had fought together with a similar sort of common aim, a common goal in mind, but as soon as they reach that goal and remove Charles, all hell breaks loose, because now they can't agree on how to govern the country now that the monarchy is over. So, as a little quick summary and recap, write these bullet points down for me, please. What are some of the key problems facing the Commonwealth and the Rump? Well, first of all, you've got to remember that the Rump has been formed through Pride's Purge. It was not elected, it was not voted for, it was effectively created by the army to ensure that they would get what they want and that Charles would be tried. So Pride's Purge in December 1648, it had reduced the Houses of Commons from 470 MPs to 211 MPs. So even though they feel as though they have got the members of Parliament sitting and acting on their side, they're still not a united body. So now we've got 211 MPs that are split amongst themselves. Only 70 of those 211 were actively involved in the trial of Charles, and then from that 70, only 59 would agree to sign his death warrant. So if we go back to the start here, from the 470 legitimate MPs that were sitting in Parliament, in the Long Parliament after the Civil Wars, now we've just got 59 that are holding their hands up and saying, yes, this is what we wanted. We signed the death warrant of Charles. That is a massive reduction from the original numbers up here. It's a small clan of radicals that appear to have gotten their way. And just because Charles has been executed doesn't mean that they are always going to get their way. In addition, the Rump, obviously, claimed that it was a legitimate continuation of the Long Parliament that had first been established in 1640 when the Bishops' Wars broke out and Charles needed money to fight the Scots. God, that seems like ages ago that we were talking about that. However, the Rump can tell anybody who'll listen, they can sing it from the rooftops with bells and whistles that they think they're legitimate, but actually, you can say it as much as you like, that doesn't mean that you are legitimate. And the truth is, the Rump only existed due to the army and the fact that Colonel Pride and the radical sects within the army led by Henry Ireton had arranged Pride's Purge, which gave birth to the Rump Parliament. Therefore, the Rump depended on the willingness of the army to support it. And I've put that word willingness in red because that is very much an area of grievance for both sides. The army had clearly become a formidable force by this point. Due to the tangled mess that was the Commonwealth, the Rump had become a servant to the army. Now that is key because actually it should be the other way around. Parliament sits, Parliament raises taxes, Parliament passes laws, Parliament employs the army to use them where deemed necessary. But because of Pride's Purge and because the army had created the Rump, this relationship is now the other way around. Parliament is increasingly finding itself in a position where they have to keep the army sweet. And that is not what the Rump wants to do. And this becomes a particular problem for Cromwell as well. As I mentioned earlier, in his heart, deepest heart, Cromwell is an army man and he cares about the army and soldiers. But he also has to actively work with the Rump if this new Commonwealth has got any chance of working at all. Parliament can't constantly give in to every need, every demand, every whim of the army, or they're never going to get anywhere. But in the same respect, the members of the Rump are almost living their political lives on the edge of a knife, thinking, Is today going to be the day where the army backfires on us? Is the army going to storm in Parliament? What's the army going to do? What are they going to think of this? Are they going to form a rebellion? We've got Irish uprisings, we've got Scottish uprisings, we've got radical religious uprisings. We need the army to help us, but at the same time, you need to keep that army on standby. You've got to pay them. It's extremely expensive to keep the new model army as a standing army effectively. So often the army wasn't paid on time. So therefore, the army rebels against the Rump. And you can see how it becomes this massive tangled mess of the Rump always fearing the army. They didn't want them, but they certainly could not live without them. And the army knew that, which gives some of these more radical members of the army a little bit of an inflated ego. For the first time, obviously they played a key role in the civil wars, but not really within politics. For the first time, these ordinary members of society, their voices are being heard, and they want these changes to continue. And that is something that makes the Rump very, very nervous and causes quite a few problems later down the line. Right, so I'm going to stop talking at you now because even my voice is starting to get a little bit sore. Last thing that I want you to do for me, please, find this page in your Commonwealth Knowledge Organiser. Off the top of my head, I don't know what page it is. I think it's relatively near the start, but you might have to skip past some of the pages about Cromwell in Ireland, I think. And give this a read for me, please. So the Rump in action, total numbers of MPs, percentage of average attendance, that kind of thing. Key problems, they're some of the things that we've already talked about. And then have a look at some of the reforms and some of the policies that they passed during their life. Religious reforms, legal reforms, social reforms, and financial reforms. And then once you've given that a read, have a think. Have they really achieved anything that they wanted to achieve? Have they sorted out any of the mess, the upheaval, the unhappiness that the civil wars have brought? Have they been able to stabilise England at all? If not, why not? And are you surprised about the amount of policies that they passed during this time? One of the main criticisms of the Rump was that actually it was a little bit lazy and it didn't really do much in the several years that it was alive, really. So have a think about whether you agree with that. Thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully you've been able to keep up. If not, let me know and I can give you some extra help over email. Don't forget, on Friday as well, you owe me an essay. I've already had a couple of been turned in. Please make sure you get that sent to me for Friday. If you're struggling with it, let me know and I will give you some help. Thank you.